Clear. Stay clear. Got it?
So I tape her hands back up again. We'll sit her down on the van, leave her there. And I start listening for a heartbeat. But all I can hear is my heartbeat. It's just pounding, pounding. With Gina, dude, I love her. It's written on 24th Street Bridge. I love her, so I feel her.
Hey, Jeremiah. Feeling all right?
No.
What's wrong?
My leg.
I'm gonna eat from running, so.
No, that's not from good.
Okay. What happened?
It's from dumping her body in Fremont. That's what it's from. Mr. I daily record everything. Gina Wilcox is
Yeah.
Jeanna, dude.
How do you know her?
She's in Fremont. That's how I know her.
Is she in danger?
Can't help her no more.
The detectives, you almost hear their own shock in the interview. They're sitting down ready to investigate an auto theft, and he's just taken it to a place of harm to another human being and potentially murder. It's unbelievable to most of us that someone would come into a room, sit down, and just say, I dumped a body.
Nobody knows she's missing?
That's the part. They don't even know she's gone. Monday morning, Sunday night.
What do you mean by gone?
Like I ain't never getting out of here. And I just want to stop. I don't know.
Well, wait a minute. I gotta know if she's safe.
Connolly doesn't elaborate right away, and sometimes we call this the teasing effect that you'll see in people with psychopathy. They dangle some information, which we think is designed to get then a response from the viewer, sort of stun them, and we think that they derive some satisfaction from that.
Bunch of stuff's homeless. That's right, Bruce.
Oh, that's what you said. Why'd you throw her stuff in the alley?
Why'd I burn the van up the other day?
I don't know. I like thinking about a van. Tell me about that.
My 87 G20 van?
Yeah?
It had her in it, man. It had her in it. Had her in it.
What do you mean had her? You gave her a ride?
3 or 4 hours. Gave her a ride to Fremont. Dumped her in the ditch. I don't really care about that girl, dude.
Is she alive?
No, she's not.
He acknowledges that nobody even knew that this victim was missing, but then they know about it now because he's starting to disclose it, but also because after killing her, he stole a car and was driving erratically. So there's definitely some impulsivity, which is a feature that we see in psychopathy.
Tell me about Gina.
She's in Fremont. She's laying there in the road.
And to
Ain't
get to
covered.
Fremont?
She's not covered up.
What's she wearing?
Duct tape.
That's it?
I
Is she
remember.
naked?
That's the part that scared her, dude. To keep her from running, I got her naked. I told her I'm giving her step by step, like I'm some kind of weird teacher or prison coach. I was completely calm, completely cool. I said, this is to keep you running down the street, you know, to keep you from thinking twice about running out of here.
He describes himself like a teacher or a coach, which is like he's putting himself on a pedestal, like he's better than the victim. And this is another element of that grandiosity, including even his comfort with calling the investigators dude. I think it takes a certain level of grandiosity to be able to do that in a situation like this, and is describing this in a way as if he's talking about something other than a kidnapping, a rape, and a murder.
That night in the laundromat, we were supposed to get high. And she was supposed to move in. I don't care.
She's your girlfriend?
I wasn't giving up the world for that girl, dude. She thought that she was not on my level. She thought my level was higher than hers, that I was too much of a prize for her, and I thought the same thing of her. And she wouldn't listen, man.
That's how you think?
She wouldn't listen. She wanted to move back in with her roommate.
Okay.
But she, well, I'm going back. I never said I'd move in with you, you know. I never finalized it. I was, that laundromat.
For Connolly, for her to say, I don't want to move in with you, this isn't a relationship, or this isn't as serious as you think it is, likely was a massive rejection for him, and it challenged the fantasy that he had going in his head, that fixed delusion. And that may have been where there was an eruption of anger.
I changed it all dirt. I grabbed duct tape, the biggest roll, black duct tape, backpack, and all sorts of stupid kidnapper kid. Not necessarily a rape kid. Got in the van, we drove over there, parked right in front of me, and snuck down to the laundromat on foot. I didn't want to be seen. I see her.
Is she in the laundromat?
Yeah, she was still there. I remember sitting across the street behind a tree, waiting, want to save her, you know. I mean, that's kind of what I'm thinking when I ended her life. Right up behind her. Wanted to see how close I could get. I got a duct tape. I stand there and talk to her for a little while. Finally, I get done talking to her, and she puts her hand out like this. And I grab her hand, and I'm up immediately aggressive. I'm juggling it, holding it. I say, get up, come on, let's go. And I get really, really primal. Really, you know, I'm like, get up, let's go. She's screaming and hollering. I'm looking around to see if anybody can hear it. Wrestled to the ground, got on top of her, tied her hands up with duct tape. Kept telling her, I tried to help you. You still wouldn't listen. You just didn't try.
He talks about how he wasn't aggressive at first, but then he goes primal. This speaks to his grandiosity and narcissism. He wants the power of being able to get as close to her as possible while he's sneaking up on her. And then ultimately, you know, confronting her.
He tried. Tied her front or back. And her feet. Flipped her over. I keep, you know, threatening her and verbally aggressive, more teasing her so she knows, you know. Pick her up, throw her on my shoulder, put her in the van.
He refers to teasing her, and it is sadistic. He knows that she's frightened. So we get these three different elements as he's describing his rage, his control, and manipulation of her, as he's already made up his mind that he's going to kill her.
What was she saying? Just like, you know, you're going to drop me off, right? I said, yeah, I'll drop you off eventually. I'm just lying to her. Just lying to her. And you'll be lucky if you go home tonight. She's like, you know, she starts up here and there. And she starts talking again. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? Duct tape falls off. And I had given her a warning about that. And I said, I said, did that tape just come off of your face? You know, and she said, no. You know, basically to maintain control of the situation, to stay as calm, as collective as I was just eerily calm. I'd love to be that calm all day long. If I could have grown up that calm and been raised that calm and that collected, I think my life would have been a lot better.
Here, Connolly saying to us is, I was calm, I was cool. My guess is he had fantasized for a while about being sadistic and coercive And now that it was playing out, it was acting as a release for him. There was a buildup, and that's where he talks about he was calm and he was cool.
There is a bit of glibness and superficial charm that he's emanating, even though he may not seem charming. He has this superficiality to him, as if he's almost trying to get them engaged in the conversation, to lure them in with his details and the way he's describing what happened.
I got her naked, but she got scared I was gonna rape her. And I'm like, dude, I'm not gonna rape you, dude. It's gonna keep you from running. Got her laid on the bed, and she kept looking back.
Bed in your truck or
There's
your
a
van?
conversion van folded a bed seat and a bed.
Okay.
And I started to undo my belt. I started to undo my pants, and she noticed. She's like, no, 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 no. And she clenched real tight. She's like, no, no, no. You said you weren't gonna do that. She's not trying to fight it. She's not squirming. She's sitting there. I didn't like rape her as in she's screaming like you see the episode of Law and Order SVU. She's not screaming. She's not fighting.
Connolly likely had some rape fantasies, and those somehow intersected with his fantasy or belief that he was in this relationship with the victim. He loves her, they're gonna live their lives together, but to harm her sexually challenges that reality, and that is where we see him dial back from that. And he's going out of his way to minimize the rape and sexual assault component of this.
I set her up. She's not crying. She's just looking at me, you know. And I told her something like that. I told you it wouldn't hurt you, you know. We're kind of sitting there. And I wait for about 30 seconds, 30, 45 seconds. I grab the fresh rolled duct tape up front. I slap it over her nose real quick, you know, as quick as I can. I said, I want to tell you a little story. When I grew up, I was drowned. It was the best way to go. If you're ever going to die, die of suffocation. As I made her a duct tape mask, that's what I was telling her.
What was your intention of doing that?
The quickest way possible. The most humane way. I told her, I said, dude, I got 100 different things in that Foot Locker back there, in the back of that van. 100 different tools I could use that are way more painful. You just understand that somebody gave about
Be suffocated or be scared about it.
That doesn't make sense.
Connolly talks about how he duct taped her face as if it was a humane act, and how that is a quick way to die, which is ironic because it really isn't. It's an incredibly tormented way for a human being to struggle and be harmed. And the fact that he duct taped her face makes me wonder if that was his attempt to distance himself and dehumanize her. So he didn't have to look at her eyes, he didn't have to look at her face, he didn't have to look at this woman that he had this romantic fantasy going.
I used my right hand and I choke her out. And I'm holding this on top of the duct tape, and you can tell her nose is pinched down as far as it can go. It's got to be a little bit, you know, but it's going to be quick. She fights and fights and fights. And finally, with my hand on her throat and the tape, it's just, she stops fighting him.
Connolly appears to be sniffing, sniveling, crying. The display of emotions seems very shallow or very out of proportion to the gravity of the situation. If someone came in to admit that they had murdered the love of their life and that they were remorseful about it, we'd expect to see more than this steady state of sniffing going through where he's sniveling and wiping his nose. But it's very superficial, very shallow.
So I tape her hands back up again. We'll sit her down on the van, lay her there, and I start listening for a heartbeat, listening for air. But all I can hear is my heartbeat. Every time I leaned up against her chest, all I could hear was mine. My mind just pounding away. The calmness was gone. It was, the adrenaline was back. The calmness is over. like a storm or something, you know, where it calms down at the end. But inside, this adrenaline's just pounding, pounding.
He talks about the adrenaline rush. He can hear his own heartbeat. This is really, it's really in that lane of what we call a very sadistic thrill form of killing. It's quite arousing to him.
With Gina, dude, I love her, dude. It's written on 24th Street Bridge. I love her, so I killed her. I go through a neighborhood quick as I can because I'm drinking, and I'm thinking, what is just a dead body next to me? She's a corpse now, she's dead. She's laying on the floor between the chairs with her head like close so I can reach down. And I'm just driving through there so I don't get pulled over. I want to spend some time with her.
He knows she was dead. But then he also says, I wanted to spend some time with her. This was the optimal condition to be able to have a relationship experience with her because she's not going to fight back. She's not going to protest. You see that his value for human life is that they're objects. And that is very clearly that psychopathic trait that we see in individuals where there's no real value for human life.
Stumble over real quick, because I got somebody coming down the dirt road real quick. I throw her as far as I can swing her out to. I just left her there. She's like face down. You can see the hair. I guarantee you can see it. It just became reckless. I tried to cover up evidence, but nobody knows she's missing. Nobody reported her missing. These are out here chasing me around in a stolen car. Can you even notice shit was even missing? Hear more about material objects?
Connolly exemplifies failure to accept responsibility. This is a trait that we see in psychopathy where individuals will blame somebody or some event for their actions. So if only the police had noticed, like, why are they focused on this material object instead of a dead body? Why didn't anybody report her missing? I think it's also a product of his narcissism and the idea that he is, again, better than, smarter than, more capable than all of these people. The loved ones in her life, law enforcement, you name it.
Where am I going?
Well, sounds like we're gonna take you out to Fremont.
I can find it, dude. I'm just trying to do the right thing.
He's just totally disconnected to what he did. Connolly's clinical presentation isn't just about a fixed delusion. It isn't just about being a criminal. It's about being psychopathic. He is totally distanced himself and has no connection to the fact that that was a human being that he killed. You don't see any remorse. You don't see any feeling of guilt, a feeling of regret, a feeling of empathy for the fact that the victim is now dead.
Like right over here to the left, hit it with your, like this be a yard, bunch of toys. If we're on the right track, that's what it is. It's right past all that brush.
They found it.
St. Joe County Sheriff's Office, how can I help you?
Yes, ma'am. I was wondering, can I get somebody to do a wellness check?
Sure.
His name is Father Renee Robert. He's not answering the phone, and that is unusual. And I'm not sure. I think my brother might have done something to hurt him and stole his car and everything. And I wanted to have him checked on to make sure. What is his name? His name is Stephen Murray. He made the comment to my dad or something that Father Rene was tied up, and my brother's a bit crazy. He's tied my sister up a couple years back and tried to kill her. So, I mean, you know, that's what we're afraid of, that he might have hurt the old man.
A missing person report for Father Rene Robert was filed on Tuesday. Friends said when Father Rene stopped updating his social media, they knew something must be wrong.
Hey.
What's going on?
Nothing. What you doing?
Just moved into a couple houses, got some food.
Oh, I just want you to do right.
Then my life's gone now again. I threw my life away.
No, it's not gone, Bubba. It's not the end.
Then it's gone again. I got like 10 burglaries here in South Carolina, like 1 in North Carolina. I was in the raid, you know. I mean, I got a back seat full of guns in the front seat. I got a bag full of ammunition. I mean, I'm loaded, ready to go to war like being locked.
Murray is referring to himself as someone who is notorious and synonymous with a terrorist. And that level of self-importance that he's placing on his value is revealing. It gives us some indication into his narcissism, as well as his willingness maybe to harm others.
I don't know, Gene. I mean, I'm really hurting. The minute I realized that I had done killed somebody, I cried for 2 days because I know that I just threw my life away. I know that I did because I know that I didn't do it right. I know that I left my fingerprints everywhere. I know I left my DNA there, and I just cried and bawled my eyes out.
His crying is really all about him and how he messed up the crime scene and how he's done because of what he did. You don't hear anything about compassion or empathy for his victim. He's crying about his circumstance, you know, wants to be consoled in some way.
Just tell me, is Father Rene dead or alive?
Dead, Gene. He's dead. I'm sick, Gene. I mean, I'm really, really sick, Gene. I mean, I'm ill. I know what I did, and I know I have to accept it.
All right, you hang in there. We're going to figure it out.
I love you.
All right, love you too.
After a tip was called in from someone who spotted Father Rene's car near Aiken, South Carolina, U.S. Marshals were able to locate Murray. He then led authorities on a high-speed chase that ended with the car crashing into a tree.
He threatened to kill as many cops as he could, and, you know, and you're out there in the middle of the woods, and you got a guy in there with rifles and scopes.
See that green chair. Oh man. Where'd you do your time at? I'm not 20 something for a witness. I'm very tired, man. I wish somebody could just help me. Just take this from me, man.
That's what I'm here for. I drove all the way from Florida. Tell me what I need to do to help you.
Put me in a bag and shoot me in the head.
Well, we're here and we're conducting an investigation
On Father Rene.
on Father Rene. And we need your help to Try to find it.
What do you think he is right now?
I don't know. I mean, he meant as much to me as probably he did anybody else that's out there looking for him. I'm gonna make y'all shoot. Never gonna have fully loaded.
Despite claims that he wanted to go out, death by cop, suicide by cop, he created barriers to them being able to catch him. He stole the victim's car, he crashed it into a tree, lured the police officers into the woods, and ultimately, what I suspect was going on with Murray is he was enjoying the thrill of getting them running.
Sick.
And what's sick to you though?
Not somebody who want to decide. That's all. So you probably would run me out. And you probably might want to go ahead and shoot me in the head right now.
It's manipulative, and he feels sorry for himself, and he feels bad for his circumstance. So he's telling them something which is kind of wacky, just shoot me, let's get this over with. There's something foolish about the idea that the police are going to be sympathetic to a guy that, in cold blood murders a priest.
Where we see some of Murray's psychopathy manifest is in some of the grandiosity and how he's handling this interview with the detectives. Murray has that kind of willingness to play cat and mouse, to manipulate authorities, and a total lack of appreciation for the seriousness of what's going on here. He is getting his high off of this. He is enjoying the power and control and the fact that he can absolutely control the narrative.
He was like, look, I want to tell you something. I got this guy, he gives me money. He's an old man, he's a priest, and he looks out for me, Okay, that's cool, It's cool. And she said, you want to meet him? I'm like, sure,
How do he treat you?
Always treat me good. Love, respect. He was always a good man. He always helped me. This person has helped me out to the extent where nobody else would. I could call this person and say, hey, I need $200 for me.
This guy, in essence, is a parasite. He doesn't know how to have real relationships with people. He doesn't know how to be empathic or to show genuine appreciation. So as long as you're feeding him, he's a happy guy. He's getting what he needs. But if circumstances change and need be, he'll pull the trigger.
Father Rene provided him care, he provided him comfort, he provided him money. But either way, the irony is that this individual who treated him with such kindness, he still was able to treat as an object and dispose of him. He no longer had a purpose.
When did you get his car?
He didn't know that I was going to meet somebody for some weed. Which I didn't tell him that because, he's a priest and he's got a lot going on, and I wasn't going to tell him that, because out of respect.
What happened out with Shady?
I dropped him off, and I never came back. I ended up doing drugs, and I never came back and got him. And that's how I got his car.
For most psychopaths, relationships are entirely transactional. They have to be getting something out of it. They have to be gaming the other person. They have to be acquiring something. It could be sex, money, whatever the resources are.
So what did you do after that?
Just drove.
Murray believes he's a smarter criminal, and if he just continues to deny, without a body, what are they going to do? How are they going to charge him? And even the detectives, truth be told, do realize that without a confession and without a body, they are going to have a difficult time arresting him.
I felt so ashamed of what I did, I just left this man standing there, out in the middle of the cold,
You're the last person I saw him, and I think you can help me.
No, I can't. So if you're going to keep on trying to dig at me, then we ain't got nothing to talk about. I told you what I had to tell you. That digging's not going to get you nowhere. It's just going to put you in a hole.
What do you think? Is he dead?
I couldn't tell you. Me personally, I don't know. I mean, I couldn't tell you if he's dead or alive. I couldn't tell you if he needs help, medical help or nothing, because I don't know.
I mean, if he is somewhere out there still alive, it's getting to be a couple of days, and we need to know where he's at so we can help him.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if there was something I could do to help you, you know what I'm saying, do that, I would.
We see pathological lying in this interrogation all over the place. He continues to look at these detectives so sincerely. They're talking about life, and he's just trying to be so cooperative and congenial, and he continues to play dumb. I have no idea where this person is. If I could tell you, I would. And he doesn't even blink an eye. His eye contact, his affect seems very credible and very stable and consistent, and yet it's all a lie.
Another interview?
Yeah. Well, hold on.
I won't be long.
Oh, man. I'm so glad you was in here.
When a female detective walks into the interrogation, Murray's affect, his demeanor, his body language, everything shifts and it becomes brighter. He sits back, you see a level of confidence in how he's interacting with this female detective, and he's starting to flirt with her. Murray's using what we think of with psychopathic behavior as superficial charm, and this is absolutely a marker of psychopathy.
You have a decent brain and decent heart in you. So why are you here with this kind of?
You have a pretty face.
Murray isn't acknowledging her or addressing her with the same distance that he does the male detectives. It's possible he doesn't actually even see her as an authority figure or law enforcement. He just sees her as a potential female who he can victimize. He's actually trying to put her in her place. He's trying to overtake her and victimize her and humiliate her by calling her out on how attractive she is.
You've got a decent head on your shoulders. Why would you get messed up with something that you got to be sitting in a sheriff's office at an ungodly hour?
Well, you know, it's like you got this baby, newborn baby. You raise that baby. The hate, hurt, and strove to rape. You know, and the baby grows up on that.
Becomes a product of their environment.
Becomes a product of their environment. And now I deal with crying. Cry so hard. I tried my whole life to change who I am. I'm a sick puppet.
He's pouring it on thick because he wants the officers to see him as a sick person. And he's taking almost like a passive victim role himself.
Where'd you go tomorrow?
You remember that?
Downtown. That's been famous.
Okay.
That's what you want to leave it at. Change your mind and you want to tell me the actual truth, Stephen? Please do.
You call me a liar?
No,
How dare you?
Not.
I so would love a cigarette, though, man.
We can probably take care of that.
Running 100 miles an hour, I'm gonna tell y'all everything y'all need to know.
All right. It's your show, brother. We're just here to watch. Tell us.
All right.
He's coming down off the power and control dynamic. What's going to happen from here on out is at the hands of law enforcement and their discretion and their procedures. What we do see is a very deflated, flat person who no longer is congenial. He's no longer showing grandiosity and arrogance and an ego. Yet there's no humility either. This isn't somebody who looks broken because he realizes that he has remorse and empathy for what he's done to this human being.
The first part of the story I told y'all where Father Renee picked me up, which was true, and I went down to the dope trap. I ended up getting some crack and smoking, which I normally don't do, man. I just been stressed out, a lot of going on, man. And we went up to South Carolina against his will. I mean, it wasn't.
What do you mean by that?
Against his will means he didn't have a choice. He just said, okay. I mean, I wasn't aggressive with it or anything, you know. I wanted to go see my kids, you know.
Right.
And I really wanted to see my kids, and I know I was at a breaking point, you know, where I was just tired.
Murray is admitting that he lied to Father Rene. He essentially lured him in to gain access to his car. He's sharing some information with detectives about his willingness to lie, even to a priest.
How did you get him to get in the trunk?
I asked him to.
You just said, hey, I need you to get in that trunk right there?
I need you to get in the trunk, Father Rene.
Did you say or else?
No, I didn't say or else. I said, I need you to get in the trunk, Father Rene. He said, okay. I'm right in there, you know. I helped him in there and told him, I said, just do what I tell you to and everything's going to be okay, you know.
Did he seem scared?
Not really. I mean, he never changed into me the whole time.
Maybe he didn't want to be viewed by the priest as someone who's engaging in criminal behavior. By putting him in the trunk, the priest wouldn't see him doing naughty things.
He also may get a high that is just a simple power and control high from overpowering another human being, which we see in this crime against the priest.
And, you know, I'm talking to him, you know, and he's still telling me, you know, that I'm in great trouble and maybe I am in a great deal of trouble, you know.
Sure.
If he gonna go back and tell on me, though, and get me in trouble, I mean, and let's go ahead and get rid of you know.
This dynamic between them, the way he describes it, is very much like a parent and a child. You're going to be in a great deal of trouble.
He kept asking me to use the bathroom. So I stopped and let him out to use the bathroom. I had a 9mm.
You got that from one of the burglaries you did?
Yes, sir. And I shot him.
Where'd you shoot him at?
Shot him in the, I think, the chest one time and the head the last time.
He puts one in his chest. That means he was facing him directly, and then one in his head. He shot him directly, eye to eye, which is really chilling. So the priest saw it coming. I mean, it's really miserably cruel. It really reveals how vicious a guy this person is.
Did you ever tell Father Rene that, you know, anything along the lines that you were going to have to kill him?
No, sir. Go ahead.
At this point, we see Murray somewhat regressed in this interview because now he addresses the detective, no, sir. He starts talking like a child would address an adult.
So you don't think he had any idea that that's what your plan was?
And, you know, I was just having a big open with everything that I have hid already and, you know, the things that I'm going to have to face, you know?
Right.
And it didn't sink in too well, my man, because it just made things worse, and I just cried and cried and cried. I cried for days on end, you know? I mean, right. I didn't stop crying, I mean, because I know that I had up and I couldn't take none of it back, man. I mean, you know, I just gave my whole life away, you know?
The night begins with a sound no one remembers clearly, a door that may or may not have closed, footsteps that could have belonged to anyone, and a silence that arrived too fast, the kind of silence that only appears when something has already gone terribly wrong, because at 9:17 p.m. on an ordinary autumn evening in 1995, a child vanished, and the town did not realize it was holding its breath until it was far too late. She was 7 years old, small for her age, last seen wearing a red windbreaker that zipped crookedly at the top, walking the same cracked sidewalk she had walked 100 times before, past the flickering street lamp that locals joked about but never fixed, past the yard with the broken fence, past the shortcut everyone used because nothing bad ever happened there, until one night, something did. By the time her mother noticed, she hadn't come home. The clock on the microwave read 9:43, and that number would later be burned into memory, written on police forms, whispered in interviews, replayed in courtrooms that never reached a verdict, because in this case, there would be no courtroom. No handcuffs, no resolution, Only a growing sense of dread spreading house to house as porch lights snapped on one by one and neighbors stepped outside, scanning the dark with a fear they couldn't yet name. The first 911 call was calm, almost polite, the way people sound when they still believe there's a simple explanation, a wrong turn, a friendly neighbor, a delay that will be laughed about later. But minutes passed, then hours, and the comm cracked, replaced by radios squawking. Squad cars rolling in too fast, officers knocking on doors with flashlights already in their hands, because children do not simply disappear, not like this, not in a town where everyone claims to know everyone else. Search dogs traced her scent to the edge of the shortcut path and then stopped, confused, circling, whining, as if the ground itself had erased her, and that moment would become the first of many strange details, the kind that refused to fit neatly into any theory, because if she walked that path, she should have emerged on the other side, and if she was taken, there should have been something, a sign of struggle, a footprint, a thread, but there was nothing, just damp leaves and the cold realization that the trail had gone dead. By dawn, the town was unrecognizable, helicopters thudding overhead, volunteers combing fields and ditches, police tape fluttering where children used to ride bikes, and every parent watching the search, with a hand gripping their child's shoulder a little tighter. Because this was no longer about one girl, it was about the terrifying possibility that someone, somewhere, was capable of taking a child and leaving no trace at all. The media arrived before the sun fully rose, cameras lining the street, reporters repeating the same facts over and over, age, height, clothing, last seen time, until those details became a mantra, a prayer, a desperate attempt to keep her visible, because as long as her face was on the screen, as long as her name was spoken, she was still out there, somewhere. Detectives began where they always do, the family, the house, the routine, asking questions that felt cruel but necessary. When did you last see her? Who was she with? Was there anyone new in her life? Any arguments? Any secrets? And the answers came back ordinary, painfully ordinary. Because ordinary lives are not supposed to end like this. Neighbors were interviewed next, stories overlapping, contradicting. A man who thought he heard a car idling, a woman who remembered a shadow near the fence, a teenager who claimed he saw a van but couldn't describe it, couldn't remember the color, couldn't even swear it was that night. And each statement was logged, cataloged, pinned to a board that would soon be crowded with red string and unanswered questions. Then came the first break that wasn't a break at all, a backpack found miles away near a drainage canal, damp, muddy, identified within minutes, her name written inside in careful handwriting, and for a moment, hope flared because objects mean proximity, objects mean a direction. But the backpack was empty, too clean in some places, too dirty in others, as if it had been handled, moved, staged, and investigators argued quietly about what that meant, because staging implies intent, and intent implies planning. As days turned into weeks, the tone shifted, optimism draining from press conferences, replaced by cautious language and lowered voices, and the word everyone dreaded but expected began to circulate, cold case, even though the file was still warm, still heavy with effort. Because some cases freeze faster than others, locking themselves behind walls of missing evidence and bad luck. Suspects emerged, as they always do, a registered offender living 3 blocks away, questioned, released, a drifter passing through town that week, tracked down, cleared, a teacher with a strange demeanor, rumors spreading faster than facts, because when answers don't come, people create them. And suspicion becomes its own kind of contagion. Years passed, and the investigation thinned, detectives reassigned, leads drying up, the evidence boxes sealed and stacked, but the town never fully moved on. Anniversaries marked by candlelight vigils and newspaper headlines that asked the same question in different ways. Where is she now? And what happened that night? Children grew up hearing her story as a warning. Don't take shortcuts. Don't talk to strangers. Be home before dark. While adults avoided the path where the dogs had lost her scent, as if the ground itself were cursed, and the case settled into the background of daily life. Unresolved but never forgotten, a wound that scabbed over without healing. Then, decades later, something shifted, quietly at first, a box reopened, a name resurfacing, advances in forensic technology breathing new life into old evidence, and whispers began to circulate again because cold cases do not stay cold forever, not when someone somewhere knows the truth and has been carrying it all this time. A former detective, now gray and tired, would later say that some cases don't haunt you because of what you saw, but because of what you never did, the questions you didn't ask, the lead you couldn't follow, and this was one of them, a case that refused to let go. Waiting patiently for the moment when silence would finally crack. And that moment would come, not with a discovery in a field or a forgotten tape, but with a voice, unexpected, trembling, offering words no one had dared to hope for, a confession that would reopen everything, shake a nation, and force a reckoning with the past, because the truth, when it finally surfaces, never arrives gently, and the night that child vanished was only the beginning. The call did not come to the police station first, and that detail would matter later, because it came in the early hours of a rain-soaked morning to a local radio newsroom, a shaky voice asking if the line was being recorded, asking if anyone there remembered the girl who disappeared in 1995, asking if anyone still cared, and the producer on duty, half awake and irritated, almost hung up before the caller said one sentence that snapped the room to attention. "I know what happened to her, and I can't carry it anymore." By the time detectives were alerted, the caller was gone. No name given, no number left behind, just a recording logged on a dusty tape that would be replayed again and again, the voicemail, older, strained, slipping between clarity and panic, referencing details that had never been released to the public, the crooked zipper, the shortcut path, the backpack placed where it would be found, and suddenly a case long considered frozen began to sweat. Investigators moved fast, pulling the old files, spreading photographs across conference tables, faces of suspects long dead or long forgotten staring back with the same mute defiance, because time does not erase a crime, it only buries it under layers of routine and resignation. And this call had dug straight through those layers, reopening wounds the department had learned to live with. They traced the broadcast footprint, narrowed the call to a cluster of payphones that no longer existed, cross-referenced voices with old interviews, played the tape for officers who had worked the case decades earlier, watching their reactions closely. Because sometimes recognition comes not as certainty, but as discomfort, a tightening of the jaw, a look held a second too long. Outside the station, the news spread before an official statement could be crafted, social media exploding with speculation, headlines screaming that a missing child cold case had been reopened, that a confession had surfaced, that answers might finally be coming, and the town, older now, grayer, quieter, felt the past surge back like a sudden storm. The girl's family was notified in person, detectives standing in a living room that had changed furniture, but not grief, explaining carefully, cautiously, that there had been a development, that nothing was confirmed yet, that hope was dangerous, but unavoidable. And her mother listened without sitting down, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles blanched, because for years she had imagined this moment in 100 different ways and none of them had prepared her for the sound of the word confession. The investigation pivoted, not toward what happened that night, but toward who could still be alive to talk about it, reviewing old witness lists, re-interviewing neighbors who had once spoken freely and now hesitated, memories dulled by time. Fear sharpened by the realization that if the truth was coming out now, it meant someone had lived among them all this time knowing exactly what they had done. One name surfaced repeatedly, not as a suspect, but as a presence, a man who had been interviewed early on and dismissed, a volunteer searcher who knew the terrain too well, who had pointed out the shortcut path to officers as if guiding them, who had appeared helpful, eager, forgettable. And that forgettability, investigators realized, might have been the point. He was brought in quietly, no cameras, no announcement, a routine follow-up, and he sat across from detectives in a room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, hands folded, posture relaxed, answering questions with practiced ease. But when the recording of the radio call was played, something changed, not dramatically, not enough for an observer to shout guilt, but enough to register, a slight flinch, a breath held a beat too long, eyes dropping to the table before returning to meet the room. The interview stretched for hours, looping back on itself, detectives pressing on timelines, inconsistencies, the way his story had shifted over the years, and he countered with denials, explanations, appeals to faulty memory, until fatigue set in and the mask began to slip, not into confession, but into irritation, then anger, because nothing destabilizes a carefully maintained lie like the suggestion that it is no longer needed. Forensics teams reopened evidence boxes sealed since the late 90s, items once considered useless now examined with new technology, fibers reanalyzed, degraded samples coaxed into yielding partial profiles, and the process was slow, painstaking. Because the past does not give up its secrets easily, and every result came back with margins of error and cautious language, enough to suggest, not enough to prove. Meanwhile, the voice on the tape became a character in its own right, dissected by experts, its cadence analyzed, its emotional peaks mapped, and one analyst noted the way the caller corrected himself mid-sentence when describing the night, as if catching details that should not have slipped out, as if aware, even in confession, of the danger of saying too much. The public demanded answers, protests forming outside the station, signs held aloft with the girl's face now aged by software into a stranger everyone felt they knew, because unresolved cases invite projection, and this one had waited long enough to become symbolic, not just of a missing child, but of a system that had failed to protect her. Pressure mounted on prosecutors to act, but they hesitated because a confession without a body, without corroboration, is a fragile thing, and fragile cases shatter under scrutiny. Yet doing nothing felt like betrayal, like letting the past slip away again. Then another call came, this one directly to detectives, the same voice, more controlled, more resigned, offering to meet, setting conditions, no media, no charges announced, and the implication hung heavy in the air because people who are truly innocent do not negotiate their own confessions. The meeting place was a neutral location, chosen for anonymity, and when the man arrived, older than his voice suggested, shoulders slumped under the weight of years, he did not look like a monster, which unsettled everyone in the room. Because monsters are easier to face than ordinary men who make monstrous choices. He spoke haltingly at first, circling the truth, testing the room, then, slowly, details emerged, a chance encounter, a moment of panic, a decision that could not be undone, and as he talked, detectives realized with a sinking certainty that some of what he said aligned too perfectly with facts never made public, while other parts raised new questions, contradictions that suggested either a fractured memory or a carefully constructed half-truth. No remains were produced, no clear location given, only gestures, vague references to water, to distance, to a place that might no longer exist, altered by development and time, and the frustration in the room was palpable because after decades of silence, the truth was arriving in fragments. Sharp enough to cut, but not enough to heal. When the meeting ended, the man was not arrested, not yet, and that decision would ignite outrage, headlines screaming about a confession without consequences, about justice delayed and denied, but behind closed doors, investigators wrestled with the same question that had haunted them since 1995. How do you prove what everyone feels in their bones is true? As night fell again over the town, the same streetlights flickering, the same shortcut path avoided, the case hung in a new kind of limbo, no longer cold, not yet solved, suspended between revelation and doubt, and the voice that had broken the silence now echoed everywhere, on televisions, in kitchens, in the quiet moments before sleep, because once a secret is spoken aloud, it cannot be taken back, and the past, long buried, does not stay quiet when it is finally disturbed. By the third week after the confession surfaced, the town had split into camps without ever formally choosing sides, those who believed the voice on the tape was a breakthrough, and those who believed it was a lie too convenient, too late, because when a cold case reopens after decades, it does not bring clarity first, it brings chaos, and chaos has a way of exposing fractures that were always there. Investigators returned to the shortcut path, now overgrown, partially fenced off by new construction, the ground reshaped by time and neglect, and they walked it slowly, deliberately, measuring distances, imagining a child's stride, an adult's panic. The narrow window in which everything could have gone wrong, because scenes do not disappear, they just wait to be reinterpreted. Ground-penetrating radar swept across patches of Earth that had once been empty fields, now parking lots and drainage channels, the machine humming like a low, anxious breath, technicians staring at screens for anomalies, for disruptions in the soil that might suggest a secret buried and forgotten. But the readings came back inconclusive, the past refusing once again to leave a clean signature. The man who had come forward remained in a strange position, neither charged nor cleared, living under a microscope, reporters parked outside his home, neighbors whispering as he passed, his face now inseparable from the case, and yet legally untouched. A reminder that suspicion and proof are not the same thing, no matter how closely they resemble each other in the public imagination. Detectives began to dismantle his story piece by piece, mapping his movements on the night in question against phone records, employment logs, weather reports, anything that could anchor memory to fact, and inconsistencies emerged, small at first, a time that didn't align, a route that made no sense, details that shifted subtly with each retelling, not enough to dismiss him outright, but enough to suggest that truth, if present, was being filtered through something else. Psychologists were consulted, experts in false confessions and delayed admissions, explaining how guilt can distort memory, how fear can embellish, how attention itself can become intoxicating, and their assessments added another layer of uncertainty, because the human mind, especially after decades, is an unreliable narrator, capable of convincing itself of things that never happened or reshaping what did into something more bearable. Meanwhile, another thread resurfaced from the original investigation, one that had been logged, shelved, and forgotten. A report from a jogger who had seen a child matching the description near service road miles from the shortcut path late that same night. A sighting dismissed at the time as mistaken, but now reconsidered, because cold cases teach investigators one lesson over and over. The first answer is not always the right one. The jogger, now in her 60s, was located and interviewed again, her memory cautious but firm, recalling headlights, a car pulled over awkwardly, a small figure standing still as if unsure which direction to go, and the detail that caught detectives' attention was not what she saw, but what she felt, a sense that something was wrong, that she should have stopped, that hesitation had cost something irreversible. This potential sighting shifted the map, extending the possible range, introducing the idea that the child may have survived longer than initially believed, that the shortcut path was not the end but the beginning, and that possibility reopened debates that had been considered settled, forcing investigators to question assumptions they had lived with for decades. Pressure intensified when leaked documents hit the press, fragments of the confession, notes from internal meetings, and suddenly the public was not just watching the investigation, it was participating in it, dissecting every line, every pause in the recording. Amateur analysts flooding forums with theories, because when official answers stall, speculation fills the void. The family watched all of this from the center of the storm, their grief repackaged as content, their hope scrutinized for signs of weakness, and they released a statement asking for patience, for respect, for the truth, whatever it was, because uncertainty, they said, had already taken enough from them. Behind closed doors, prosecutors debated strategy, weighing the risk of moving forward with a case that might collapse against the moral weight of doing nothing, and that tension seeped into every decision, every press conference carefully worded, every refusal to comment interpreted as confirmation of something darker. Then came the second shock, quieter but no less destabilizing, when forensic analysts reported a partial match from re-examined evidence, not enough to identify a single individual, but enough to exclude others, narrowing the field in a way it never had before, and notably, the partial profile did not align cleanly with the man who had confessed. That revelation fractured the narrative completely, raising the possibility that the confession was incomplete, misleading, or that more than one person had been involved, a prospect that chilled investigators, because complexity is the enemy of resolution, especially in cases already stretched thin by time. Detectives revisited old associates, co-workers, acquaintances from 1995, people who had drifted away, changed names, moved on, and some of them reacted with surprise, others with practiced indifference, but a few displayed something else, discomfort that lingered too long. Defensiveness where none was required, and those reactions were logged carefully, because in the absence of hard evidence, behavior becomes data. One former coworker mentioned an offhand comment made years ago, a joke that hadn't sounded like a joke even then, about how easy it would be for a child to disappear in that part of town. And while jokes are not crimes, they can be echoes, reverberations of thoughts people never intended to share. As these fragments accumulated, the case began to resemble a mosaic with too many missing tiles, patterns emerging only to dissolve under scrutiny, and the detectives leading the investigation felt the familiar exhaustion of chasing truth through a maze built by time, lies, and fading memory. Public confidence wavered, some accusing law enforcement of incompetence, others of conspiracy, because unresolved cases invite mistrust, and the longer answers are delayed, the more people assume there must be a reason beyond simple difficulty. Through it all, the voice on the tape remained the emotional core, replayed endlessly, its final moments analyzed frame by frame, the slight catch in the throat, the pause before the last sentence, and experts debated whether it sounded like relief or regret. Whether it was the sound of a man unburdening himself or one setting a trap. As winter approached, investigators faced a grim reality that despite renewed effort, new technology, and national attention, they were still circling the same fundamental question that had haunted them since the night the child vanished, who took her and why, and the answers, once again, seemed just out of reach. The case, now officially reopened, had moved from dormancy to disarray, from silence to noise, and in that noise, the truth was either being amplified or drowned out entirely, because sometimes reopening a cold case does not warm it, it fractures the ice, revealing dark water beneath. Deeper and more dangerous than anyone expected. The fourth month after the reopening brought a different kind of tension, quieter on the surface, heavier underneath, because when investigations stop producing dramatic turns, they begin to grind, and grinding cases wear down everyone involved. Especially when the truth feels close enough to touch, but refuses to take shape. Detectives shifted focus again, not forward but backward, combing through procedural decisions made in 1995, asking uncomfortable questions about what had been overlooked, deprioritized, or quietly dismissed in the rush of those early days, because cold cases often survive not on mystery alone, but on human error layered carefully over time. One oversight stood out almost immediately, a box of tips logged during the first week after the disappearance, hundreds of calls from the public, handwritten notes, vague sightings, rumors, and one entry that had never been followed up properly. A call about a car seen idling near the shortcut path that night, engine running, lights off, the driver unseen, and the reason it had been dismissed was painfully simple. There had been too many cars, too many calls, too much noise. That car became an obsession, investigators cross-referencing vehicle registrations from the mid-90s, narrowing by model descriptions that were frustratingly broad, dark-colored, older, possibly a sedan, because memory under stress tends to blur details. But persistence has a way of sharpening focus, and patterns began to emerge. A list of potential vehicles was compiled, owners tracked down, some deceased, some cooperative, some defensive, and among them was a name that had appeared before, not in the spotlight, but on the edges of the case, a man who lived just far enough away to avoid immediate suspicion, whose car matched multiple vague descriptions, and whose alibi for that night relied entirely on his own word. When detectives visited him, he was polite, calm, almost welcoming, offering coffee, answering questions without hesitation, and yet something about the interaction felt rehearsed, his story delivered with a smoothness that lacked the hesitations of genuine recollection. Because real memories stumble, they contradict themselves, they search for footing, and his did none of that. They asked about the shortcut path, and he claimed to avoid it, said it was unsafe even back then, and that statement, meant to distance him, instead raised eyebrows, because few people considered it dangerous before the disappearance. And fear is rarely retroactive unless it is informed by something else. As they left, One detective noted the way he stood in the doorway long after they had reached the car, watching, not curious, not confused, but measuring, as if trying to calculate how much had just been revealed and how much remained hidden. Back at the station, timelines were laid side by side. The confession narrative, the jogger's sighting, the idle car tip, and they did not align cleanly, overlapping in ways that suggested either multiple players or a single story fractured by misdirection. And that realization unsettled the team more than any lack of evidence ever had. The man who had confessed was brought back in for additional questioning, confronted with the possibility that his version of events did not account for everything, and his reaction was immediate, defensive, accusing investigators of twisting his words, of looking for someone else to blame. And in that defensiveness, something surfaced: resentment, not fear of punishment, but fear of being exposed as only part of the truth. He admitted then that he had not been alone that night, not explicitly, not in a way that could be acted on, but enough to plant the idea, a vague reference to someone else nearby, someone who knew the area, someone who had helped after the fact, and when pressed for names, he shut down completely. Invoking memory loss, emotional distress, legal counsel. That partial admission rippled outward, changing the tone of the investigation yet again, because shared guilt complicates everything: loyalty, fear, silence reinforced by years of mutual dependence, and detectives realized that if more than one person had been involved, the odds of a clean confession had just dropped dramatically. The media seized on the ambiguity, headlines shifting from certainty to confusion, from solved cold case to tangled web, and public trust wavered again, commentators arguing over whether the reopening had been a mistake, whether false hope was worse than none at all. Behind the scenes, forensic teams continued their work, revisiting the backpack with fresh eyes, new techniques revealing microscopic traces missed before, pollen from a specific plant species not native to the shortcut path, but common near the service road mentioned by the jogger. A detail small enough to be dismissed by anyone looking for certainty, but powerful to those who understood how rarely such coincidences occur. That discovery redirected searches, bringing teams to areas long written off, patches of land altered by drainage projects, construction, erosion, and the work was slow, methodical, shovels biting into soil that had not been disturbed in decades. Each layer peeled back with the knowledge that time itself was the greatest adversary. Volunteers joined again, many of them too young to remember the original disappearance, drawn by a sense of unfinished business, by the idea that history could still be corrected, and their presence brought both comfort and unease to the family, because hope, once revived, becomes fragile, easily shattered by another dead end. Late one afternoon, a fragment was found, not what everyone feared, not remains, but fabric, degraded, color faded, and when it was lifted carefully from the earth, the silence that fell over the site was profound, because everyone understood what it might represent, even before confirmation. Testing would take weeks. Experts cautioned against assumptions, but the find reignited the investigation in a way nothing else had, turning speculation back into urgency, and as word leaked, the town held its breath once more, reliving the cycle of anticipation and dread. The man with the matching car was contacted again, this time with more direct questions, and his demeanor changed, impatience replacing politeness, his answers clipped, his insistence on irrelevance growing louder, and when asked where he had been the night the child disappeared, he repeated his alibi verbatim, as if reciting from a script memorized long ago. Detectives noticed something else then, a discrepancy between his stated routine and employment records from that period, small, easy to miss, a shift change swapped, a late-night errand that could not be corroborated, and suddenly his certainty looked less solid, less rehearsed, and more defensive. As pressure mounted, so did mistakes, slips of the tongue, inconsistencies that accumulated slowly but steadily, and while none of them amounted to proof, together they formed a silhouette, the shape of a story that had been hiding in plain sight. The family was informed of the new developments cautiously, warned again about expectations, about the limits of evidence after so many years, but they listened with a quiet intensity, because even fragments, even possibilities, were more than they had lived with for decades. As winter deepened, The case reached a strange equilibrium, not stalled, not advancing, suspended between revelation and collapse, and those closest to it felt the weight of that suspension acutely, because the longer it lasted, the more likely it was to break in one direction or the other. At night, lights still flickered along the old shortcut path, now blocked by temporary fencing, and residents avoided looking too closely because the reopening had reminded everyone of an uncomfortable truth, that the past is never truly past, and when it finally demands attention, it does so without regard for readiness or comfort. The cold case had not warmed as expected, it had deepened, revealing layers of complicity, silence, and mischances, and somewhere within that complexity, the answer waited, patient, elusive, and increasingly dangerous to those who had spent years ensuring it stayed hidden. By the time spring arrived, the investigation had developed a rhythm that felt almost ritualistic, bursts of frantic activity followed by long stretches of silence, and it was in those quiet stretches that the weight of the case pressed hardest, because unanswered questions do not fade. They accumulate, stacking year upon year, until even the smallest development feels momentous. The fabric fragment was confirmed to be consistent with the missing child's clothing, not definitive, not conclusive, but close enough to collapse the distance between theory and reality, and when the news reached the family, there was no celebration, no release, only a slow, shared understanding that the case had crossed a line it could never retreat from. Search teams returned to the area surrounding the find, expanding outward in methodical grids, soil sifted, debris catalogued, every inch treated as if it might still hold a voice from the past, and the work attracted attention again, helicopters circling, cameras zooming in. The familiar choreography of hope and dread replayed for a new generation of viewers. Detectives leaned harder on the man with the matching car, re-interviewing him under stricter conditions, confronting him with inconsistencies, with the pollen evidence, with the jogger's sighting, and while he continued to deny involvement, his confidence eroded, his answers shorter. His irritation sharper because denial requires energy, and energy fades under sustained pressure. At the same time, the man who had confessed began to retreat from the narrative he himself had set in motion, claiming misinterpretation, emotional distress, insisting that his words had been exaggerated by media hungry for closure, and that reversal deepened suspicion rather than easing it. Because people rarely walk back the truth without a reason. Investigators compared the two men's stories side by side, noting overlaps that were too precise to be coincidence and gaps that suggested coordination, silence maintained through mutual vulnerability and the possibility of a pact, spoken or unspoken, settled over the team like a fog. Financial records from the mid-90s were re-examined, bank statements, employment histories, sudden changes that might indicate stress, travel, or concealment, and while most of the data was mundane, one anomaly surfaced, a short-term loan taken out days after the disappearance by the car owner. Paid back quickly, with no clear explanation, a small detail that took on outsized significance in a case built on fragments. Witnesses from that period were contacted again, some reluctantly, others eager to finally unburden themselves, and one former neighbor admitted that she had seen the child arguing with an adult near a vehicle that night, but had convinced herself she was mistaken. Because the alternative was too terrible to accept, and that admission underscored a truth investigators knew well, that denial is often the first accomplice. The community reacted unevenly, some rallying behind law enforcement, others accusing them of chasing shadows, of rewriting history to justify past failures, and the tension seeped into town meetings, school events, everyday interactions, because unresolved trauma does not stay confined to the past. It resurfaces wherever people gather. As weeks passed without a definitive breakthrough, prosecutors grew cautious again, reminding detectives of the high bar required to move forward, warning that a case built on circumstantial evidence and partial confessions risked collapse. And that warning frustrated those closest to the investigation, because justice delayed had already exacted a cost no court could measure. The man with the matching car hired legal counsel, a move that was his right but carried symbolic weight, signaling a shift from cooperation to defense, and when detectives requested another interview, it was declined. The door closing not with a slam, but with a firmness that left little room for negotiation. In response, investigators focused on building a circumstantial web, mapping relationships, movements, opportunities, and that process revealed another unsettling possibility, that the child's disappearance had been facilitated by familiarity. That she had known at least one of the people involved well enough to approach without fear, a theory that reframed the entire case in darker terms. That idea haunted the family, forcing them to reconsider memories they had clung to for comfort, neighbors they had trusted, routines they had believed were safe, and the emotional toll of that reevaluation was visible in their public appearances, grief layered now with betrayal. Late one night, as detectives reviewed files yet again, a pattern emerged that had been overlooked, a series of minor incidents reported in the years before the disappearance. Children approached, followed, frightened but unharmed. Incidents dismissed as misunderstandings, logged and forgotten. And while none could be definitively linked, together they suggested a prelude, a rehearsal for something worse. The revelation reframed the disappearance not as an isolated event, but as the culmination of escalating behavior, and that shift intensified the urgency because it implied intent formed over time, decisions made deliberately, rather than a moment of panic gone wrong. Search efforts expanded once more, this time to bodies of water mentioned obliquely in the confession, divers combing murky depths, sonar scanning for anomalies, and each negative result tightened the knot in everyone's chest because absence, in cases like this, speaks as loudly as discovery. The media cycle grew restless, commentators speculating about cover-ups, about incompetence, about the possibility that the truth would never fully emerge, and that noise threatened to drown out the careful, unglamorous work still underway. The slow accumulation of facts that rarely make headlines but build cases. The family released another statement, asking the public not to forget, not to reduce their child to a headline or a theory, and their words resonated, reminding people that behind every cold case is a life interrupted, a future erased, and a silence that echoes through decades. As summer approached, investigators faced a stark reality that despite renewed energy, new technology, and mounting circumstantial evidence, the case still balanced on the edge of uncertainty, and the next move would determine whether it tipped toward resolution or slipped back into limbo. The two men at the center of suspicion continued their uneasy dance with law enforcement, one receding into legal protection, the other into ambiguity, and that stalemate frustrated everyone, because stalemates favor those with the most to lose by speaking. Behind closed doors, a decision loomed, whether to push forward with charges based on what they had, risking failure, or to wait, hoping for one more piece, one undeniable fact that could transform suspicion into proof, and that choice weighed heavily because in cold cases, timing is everything. As nights grew warmer and the town settled into a cautious normalcy, the reopened case cast a long shadow, reminding everyone that some questions do not fade with time, they sharpen, and that the disappearance of a child is not an event confined to a single night, but a wound that bleeds quietly across years. The investigation had reached a point where every answer generated new questions, every step forward revealed how far there was still to go, and somewhere in that widening gap between what was known and what was provable, the truth remained hidden, waiting for the moment when pressure, chance, or conscience would finally force it into the light. By midsummer, the case had entered its most dangerous phase, not because of what investigators knew, but because of what they were beginning to suspect, that the truth was no longer buried in the ground or hidden in forgotten files, but actively resisting discovery, protected by time, fear, and the quiet cooperation of people who had learned how to live with a secret. The stalemate hardened, interviews stalled, subpoenas challenged, records lost to retention limits and bureaucratic decay, and detectives felt the investigation tightening around them like a closing fist. Because every cold case reaches a moment where momentum either breaks through or collapses under its own weight. It was during one of those stalled weeks that a seemingly insignificant detail resurfaced, a maintenance log from a municipal drainage project completed shortly after the child disappeared, documenting soil removal, transport routes, dumping locations, paperwork filed and forgotten, and one entry, barely legible, noted an unscheduled late-night adjustment near the service road, authorized verbally, no supervisor's signature recorded. That entry reignited a theory investigators had been reluctant to embrace. That evidence, perhaps even remains, may have been unknowingly moved, scattered, erased by routine work, not through malice but indifference, and that possibility was devastating. Because it meant the past had been altered irreversibly, not by a criminal act, but by ordinary progress. Teams traced the soil disposal routes, visiting remote landfill sites, overgrown dumping areas now layered under decades of debris, and while the chances of recovery were slim, the act of searching carried its own weight, a refusal to concede that time alone could defeat justice. The man with the matching car became increasingly isolated, his social circle shrinking, his routines disrupted, neighbors avoiding eye contact, and that social pressure began to produce cracks, small but telling, an argument overheard, a door slammed too hard. A late-night call to someone he had not spoken to in years, and investigators watched closely, because pressure does not always produce confession. Sometimes it produces mistakes. The confessed man, meanwhile, began leaving cryptic messages with his attorney, statements hinting at regret, at unfinished truth, at fear of retaliation, and those hints were relayed cautiously to detectives because they suggested a dynamic more complex than simple guilt. A web of dependency and threat that had endured for decades. When confronted indirectly with the idea that others might be implicated, he reacted not with denial but with silence, a long, deliberate silence that spoke louder than words, because silence is often the last refuge of those who know that speaking would unravel more than they can control. Investigators turned again to behavioral analysis, mapping stress responses, communication patterns, moments where fear outweighed strategy, and they noted a shift, subtle but consistent, both men reacting not to evidence, but to each other's perceived movements, as if each were waiting for the other to break first. That realization reframed the case entirely, suggesting that the key to resolution might not be physical evidence or forensic breakthroughs, but leverage, timing, and understanding the fragile balance, holding the silence together. Behind the scenes, prosecutors authorized a limited immunity framework, not publicly announced, designed to test that balance, signaling through legal channels that cooperation could alter outcomes, and while no deals were offered outright, the implication was clear. The stalemate did not have to end in mutual destruction. The first reaction came not from either suspect, but from someone adjacent, a former associate who requested anonymity, offering information in exchange for protection, claiming to have heard conversations years ago, fragments of panic and planning. References to that night, spoken only when alcohol loosened caution. His account was fragmented, unreliable in places, but it introduced a new element, the idea that the aftermath, not the act itself, had bound people together, shared fear forging loyalty stronger than guilt alone. Investigators corroborated what they could, verifying dates, relationships, moments of proximity, and while much of it remained circumstantial, it filled gaps that had long resisted explanation, particularly how so little had surfaced for so long. The family was briefed again, their expressions a study in restraint, hope tempered by years of disappointment, and when asked how they felt about the possibility of multiple people knowing and staying silent, the answer was quiet and devastating, that they had always suspected as much. Because silence like this is rarely solitary. As August heat settled over the town, tempers flared, patience thinned, and public opinion shifted once more, some calling for arrests regardless of outcome, others warning against the dangers of prosecuting a case built on inference. And that division mirrored the internal conflict facing investigators themselves. Late one evening, detectives received an unexpected message, not a confession, not a tip, but coordinates, handwritten, mailed without return address, pointing to a stretch of land outside town, altered by years of erosion, flooding, and neglect, and while anonymous tips were nothing new, this one carried a specificity that could not be ignored. Search teams mobilized quietly, working through the night, flashlights cutting through tall grass, soil tested, ground probed, And as dawn approached, fatigue threatened to overtake purpose, because nights like this had ended in disappointment too many times before. Then, just before sunrise, a signal registered, faint, ambiguous, but enough to halt movement, to draw everyone's attention to a single point in the earth, and in that moment, the air shifted, the familiar weight of the case concentrating into a sharp, breathless stillness. Excavation began slowly, carefully, each inch documented, and while nothing definitive emerged immediately, the act itself marked a turning point, because the investigation had moved from speculation back to ground truth, from theory to touch. News of the search leaked within hours, headlines flaring again, speculation reignited, and both men at the center of suspicion reacted in telling ways, one retreating completely from public view, the other making repeated attempts to contact his attorney, urgency replacing ambiguity. Investigators understood then that the balance was shifting, that secrets held for decades were beginning to feel heavier than exposure, and that whatever lay beneath that patch of land, whether confirmation or another dead end, the psychological terrain had already changed. As the sun climbed higher and the search continued, the reopened cold case pressed forward into its most volatile chapter yet, where fear, fatigue, and truth collided, and everyone involved sensed that the long silence was nearing its end, because secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, do not survive sustained pressure forever. The dig ended without ceremony, no dramatic reveal, no moment that cameras could freeze into history, just a careful refilling of earth and a quiet acknowledgement that whatever had drawn them there had either been moved, destroyed, or had never been what they hoped it was. And that anticlimax hit harder than failure, because it suggested intention, not chance, guiding the disappearance of evidence. For investigators, the empty ground was not a defeat but a message, confirmation that someone had understood enough, early enough, to make sure nothing definitive would remain, and that realization reframed the entire case once more, shifting focus away from discovery and toward decision. Because if the truth could not be dug up, it would have to be spoken. Within days of the search, pressure mounted behind closed doors, subpoenas expanded, financial and communication records pulled again, this time not to establish guilt directly, but to identify fractures, stress points where loyalty might give way to self-preservation. And detectives began to play a longer game, one built on patience rather than urgency. The man with the matching car broke first, not with a confession, but with an error, a late-night drive logged by a license plate reader far outside his usual routine, near one of the landfill sites connected to the old drainage project, and while the trip itself proved nothing, its timing and secrecy raised immediate alarms, because innocent people do not revisit places tied to decades-old rumors without reason. When questioned, he offered an explanation that unraveled under scrutiny, details conflicting with traffic data, his irritation flaring into visible anxiety, and for the first time since the reopening, detectives saw something close to fear, not of arrest, but of exposure, of a story collapsing under its own weight. Simultaneously, the confessed man made an unexpected move, requesting a meeting without intermediaries, no lawyers present initially, a request that set off alarms and debate, because such meetings can be manipulative, theatrical, or transformative. And the decision to allow it was made with caution, every word recorded, every pause noted. He arrived thinner, visibly exhausted, the ambiguity that had defined him giving way to something closer to desperation, and when he spoke, his voice lacked the careful construction of earlier statements, slipping instead into fragments, admissions wrapped in caveats, truths hedged with fear. He described the night again, but this time, the emphasis shifted, less on himself and more on circumstances, on being present rather than in control, on watching something unfold rather than initiating it, and while detectives challenged him repeatedly, the narrative held in one critical way: that he had not acted alone, and that the fear keeping him silent now is not legal, but personal. He named no one, but he described dynamics, power, leverage established long ago, favors exchanged, threats implied rather than spoken, and as he spoke, detectives recognized patterns familiar from other cases, the way shared wrongdoing evolves into shared survival, binding people together long after the original act. The meeting ended without resolution, but its impact was immediate because it confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect, that the case was not stalled by lack of evidence alone, but by an equilibrium of fear, each person involved waiting for someone else to make the first irreversible move. That equilibrium shattered quietly 2 days later, when the former associate who had come forward earlier was found dead, ruled a suicide within hours. No note, no prior history, and while official statements urged caution, the timing was impossible to ignore because fear has consequences. And sometimes those consequences are fatal. The death sent shockwaves through the investigation, halting momentum and accelerating it at the same time, because while one potential source of information was gone, the event itself became a piece of evidence, a signal that the stakes were higher than anyone had publicly acknowledged. Investigators tightened security around remaining witnesses, revisited risk assessments, and began to view the case not just as a historical crime, but as an active threat, because unresolved violence has a way of echoing forward, affecting the present as surely as it scarred the past. Public reaction was swift and divided, some seeing the death as tragic coincidence, others as confirmation of a cover-up that extended far beyond 2 men and a single night, and the town's unease deepened, old trust eroding under the weight of suspicion and rumor. The family was informed privately, their reaction restrained but resolute, a quiet insistence that the investigation continue without hesitation, because fear, they said, had already taken enough, and stopping now would only ensure it took more. Prosecutors reassessed strategy, the calculus shifting after the death, because juries respond not just to facts, but to narratives, and this case now carried the unmistakable shape of something darker, something sustained over time by intimidation and silence. Charges were discussed again, not finalized, but closer than ever before, and detectives were instructed to prepare for the possibility that imperfect cases sometimes must move forward, not because they guarantee conviction, but because they force truth into the open. The man with the matching car sensed the shift immediately, his behavior growing erratic, routines abandoned, calls placed to people he had not contacted in decades, and surveillance captured moments of visible distress, hands shaking, pacing. Glances over shoulders that suggested a man watching the walls close in. The confessed man, by contrast, grew calmer, a change that unsettled investigators, because calm after pressure often signals decision, a choice made quietly, internally, about what comes next. As summer edged toward its end, the reopened cold case reached a precipice, no longer defined by what was missing, but by what threatened to emerge, because the silence that had protected it for so long was fracturing, and once fractured, it could not be restored. Everyone involved felt it: detectives, prosecutors, witnesses, the family, even the town itself, a collective sense that the long night that began in 1995 was approaching dawn, not a gentle one, but a harsh, exposing light that would reveal not just what happened to a missing child, but how many people had lived alongside that truth without ever speaking it aloud. The weeks that followed felt suspended, as if time itself were hesitating, unsure whether to move forward or recoil, because once fear enters an investigation openly, it changes the rules, and nothing proceeds the way it did before. Law enforcement tightened its circle, information compartmentalized, briefings shortened, names spoken less freely, because the death of a witness had transformed caution into necessity, and the case was no longer just about the past. It was about preventing another silence from being enforced permanently. Prosecutors authorized deeper financial probes, not just into suspects but into peripheral figures, favors called in, debts forgiven, quiet transactions that left no obvious paper trail but suggested a long-standing economy of mutual protection. And while none of it pointed cleanly to the night in 1995, it painted a picture of influence extending far beyond a single crime. The man with the matching car missed an appointment with his attorney, then another, his phone going unanswered for hours at a time, and when he finally resurfaced, he offered explanations that rang hollow even to himself, because avoidance has a rhythm, and his was accelerating. Detectives noticed something else, a shift in how he spoke about the past, no longer dismissive, but brittle, correcting himself mid-sentence, circling details he once stated confidently, as if realizing too late that memory can be both a shield and a trap. When confronted with the death of the former associate, he reacted with visible shock, followed quickly by anger, railing against the investigation, against media pressure, against a system he claimed was ruining lives without proof, and that reaction was logged carefully. Because outrage can be genuine, but it can also be a cover for fear losing its grip. The confessed man was brought in again, this time with clear parameters: cooperation in exchange for protection, not immunity, not absolution, but safety, and the offer changed the tone immediately, because fear of retaliation outweighs fear of prison more often than people realize. He spoke slowly, deliberately, as if choosing words not just for accuracy, but for survival, and while he still avoided naming names, he confirmed structures: who held power, who followed, who cleaned up, who stayed silent because silence had been rewarded. He described the aftermath in greater detail, the frantic decisions, the sense that something irreversible had occurred, and the collective choice to prioritize preservation over accountability, because once lines are crossed, returning feels impossible. Investigators pressed him on the child, on her final moments, on whether she suffered, and his refusal to answer was immediate and absolute, a boundary he would not cross, and that refusal, paradoxically, made his other statements feel more credible, because performance rarely includes restraint. Outside the station, the town simmered, candlelight vigils held again, not just for the missing child, but for truth itself, a quiet protest against decades of unanswered questions, and those gatherings carried a different energy now, less pleading, more demanding. Media narratives shifted once more, no longer asking whether the case would be solved, but how much would be revealed, and at what cost, because the idea that a community could absorb a secret like this without consequence had collapsed under the weight of recent events. The family watched from the edges, rarely speaking publicly now, their silence interpreted by some as resignation, by others as resolve, but those closest to them knew it was neither. It was survival, a way of enduring a process that threatened to reopen every wound at once. Behind the scenes, investigators identified a pressure point they had previously overlooked: a property transfer shortly after the disappearance, land sold below market value to an intermediary with ties to both primary suspects, a transaction dismissed at the time as coincidence, now reconsidered as facilitation. That land, long since developed, became another focal point, not for excavation, but for context, understanding how geography, access, and opportunity intersected on the night the child vanished, and why certain areas had drawn attention while others remained ignored. The man with the matching car was informed that charges were being considered, not finalized, but imminent, and the effect was immediate, his posture collapsing inward, his bravado evaporating, replaced by a brittle calm that signaled a man reaching the end of his options. He asked for time, a vague request framed as necessity, and while investigators refused delays, they noted the shift, because requests for time often precede decisions that change everything. Late one evening, a call came in from a state line patrol, reporting a vehicle stopped for erratic driving, the driver disoriented, agitated, matching a description that made detectives' stomachs drop, and while no confession was made, the incident confirmed what they already feared. That pressure was pushing the case toward an unpredictable edge. The driver was released with a warning, nothing legally actionable, but the encounter was documented, and its implications rippled outward, because desperation has a trajectory, and it rarely curves back toward silence. The confessed man requested protective custody shortly thereafter, a move that spoke louder than any statement, because people do not ask for protection unless they believe the danger is real and imminent. With that request, investigators finally acknowledged what had been hovering unspoken, that the case had crossed into a space where truth and safety were inseparable, and where every decision carried consequences beyond the courtroom. Prosecutors convened a grand jury, quietly, without announcement, testimony gathered behind closed doors, fragments of the case assembled not for public consumption but for legal reckoning, and while indictments were not guaranteed, the act itself marked a point of no return. Witnesses were called, some reluctantly, others with visible relief, and the process drew out details that had never been shared publicly, moments of fear, of complicity, of choosing comfort over conscience, and each testimony added weight to a narrative long denied. The town sensed the shift before it was confirmed, an undercurrent of anticipation and dread, conversations dropping to whispers, routines disrupted, because communities feel it when a reckoning approaches, even if they cannot yet name its shape. As autumn approached again, mirroring the season of the original disappearance, the reopened cold case stood on the brink of revelation, not clean, not satisfying, but inevitable, because secrets do not unravel all at once. They fray, strand by strand, until what remains can no longer hold together. And somewhere within that unraveling, the truth about a missing child, a night in 1995, and the years of silence that followed waited to emerge, not as a single answer, but as a reckoning that would leave nothing untouched. The grand jury proceedings stretched on in near silence, days folding into weeks without public markers, and that absence of information created its own pressure, because when answers retreat behind closed doors, speculation rushes in to take their place. Inside the room, testimony came in fragments, voices lowered, memories dragged reluctantly into the light, and while no single statement delivered clarity, together they formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore, a choreography of avoidance, of knowing when not to ask questions, of understanding when silence would be rewarded and curiosity punished. The confessed man testified behind a screen, his voice steadier than anyone expected, recounting not just the night itself, but the years that followed, the constant calculation, the fear of accidental exposure, the way ordinary moments became traps. Because living with a secret like that does not fade, it mutates, embedding itself into every decision. He stopped short of naming the act directly, his words skirting the final moments, but he described the aftermath with unnerving precision, the urgency, the coordination, the agreement that what mattered most was ensuring that nothing could ever be traced cleanly back. And jurors listened in absolute silence, because they understood what he was really saying, that the truth had been dismantled piece by piece long before anyone thought to look for it. Other witnesses followed, municipal workers, former acquaintances, people whose lives had brushed against the edges of the case without ever fully intersecting, and while many claimed ignorance, their testimonies revealed something else entirely. A shared understanding that certain questions were unwelcome, that some stories were better left unfinished. Outside, the man with the matching car watched the process unravel from a distance, his presence in town reduced to brief, tense appearances, his name now spoken cautiously, as if it carried weight of its own, and surveillance captured moments of agitation that bordered on panic. A man aware that time was no longer his ally. His attorney requested meetings, floated potential cooperation, tested the waters without committing, and those overtures signaled a shift investigators had been waiting for, because negotiations are rarely initiated by those who feel secure. When he was finally brought in again, the atmosphere was different, no longer adversarial, no longer patient but final, and detectives laid out what they had, not evidence of the act itself, but the web around it, the financial anomalies, the land transactions, the behavioral patterns. The silence reinforced by fear, and they made something clear, that this case no longer hinged on a single confession. He listened without interruption, hands clasped tightly, eyes fixed on a spot just beyond the table, and when asked if he wanted to add anything, his response was not denial but exhaustion, a long exhale that seemed to carry decades of weight, because denial requires energy he no longer had. He did not confess, not fully, not in a way that would satisfy headlines, but he acknowledged involvement in the aftermath, choices made to protect himself and others, actions that, in his words, could not be undone, and that partial admission shifted the legal landscape irrevocably. Because it transformed suspicion into complicity. News of sealed indictments leaked before confirmation, names withheld, charges unspecified, and the town erupted in a frenzy of anticipation and dread, because closure, when it finally approaches, is rarely gentle. The family was notified first, told that the process was moving forward, that accountability was coming in some form, and they received the news with a mixture of relief and grief, because justice delayed for decades does not restore what was lost, it only acknowledges it. Public statements followed, carefully worded, emphasizing process over outcome, restraint over triumph, and that tone frustrated many, because after so many years, people wanted certainty, names, answers that fit neatly into headlines. But this case had never been neat, and it resisted simplification even now, because what had been uncovered was not just a crime, but a system of silence, a network of small choices that together had erased a child from the visible world. As indictments were unsealed, reactions varied, some shocked by who was named, others by who was not, and the realization settled that legal responsibility and moral responsibility do not always align, leaving gaps that no verdict can fill. Court dates were set, motions filed, strategies formed, and the machinery of justice began to turn at last, grinding slowly, deliberately, because the law moves at a pace indifferent to grief or outrage. The confessed man entered protective custody formally, his testimony now a matter of record, his safety prioritized not out of sympathy but necessity, because his voice had become a keystone, and without it, much of the case would collapse. The man with the matching car was released pending trial, conditions imposed, movements restricted, and his presence in the community became a reminder that resolution is a process, not an event, unfolding unevenly and often painfully. Media coverage intensified, analysts dissecting every filing, every procedural move, framing the case as a referendum on the justice system itself, because cold cases solved after decades force uncomfortable questions about how many others remain buried under similar silence. The town braced for impact, routines disrupted again, conversations dominated by what-ifs and accusations, and the sense of shared innocence that once defined the community finally gave way to something harder, more honest, an acknowledgement that harm can coexist with normalcy for far too long. As autumn deepened, mirroring the season of loss, the reopened cold case moved closer to its public reckoning, not promising clarity, not guaranteeing closure, but demanding attention, because the truth, once set in motion, does not stop until it has changed everything it touches. The trial began without spectacle, no dramatic perp walk, no shouted questions, just a quiet procession into a courthouse that had seen countless ordinary cases and was now tasked with carrying the weight of an extraordinary one, because some moments arrive not with noise, but with gravity. Inside the courtroom, the air felt compressed, every movement deliberate, every sound amplified, jurors filing in with expressions that shifted between curiosity and apprehension, because they understood, even before opening statements, that this was not a case offering clean lines or simple villains. Prosecutors spoke first, careful not to promise what decades of delay had made impossible, framing the case not around a single act, but around a pattern, a convergence of choices that began on a night in 1995 and extended through years of silence, concealment, and fear. And they asked the jury to consider not just what happened, but how it was allowed to disappear. The defense responded with restraint, emphasizing doubt, the absence of a body, the fragility of memory, the dangers of constructing guilt from coincidence and hindsight, and their words landed because they were true in the narrow legal sense, even as they rang hollow to those who had lived with the case for decades. Witnesses were called, some trembling, others composed to the point of detachment, recounting moments that had once seemed insignificant and now felt loaded with consequence, and with each testimony, the past grew less abstract, less safely distant. The confessed man took the stand under heavy protection, his voice steady but thin, eyes avoiding the gallery, and when he spoke, he did not offer absolution or redemption, only explanation, a chronology of fear, pressure, and decisions made under the belief that exposure would destroy more lives than silence ever could. He described the night again, stopping short of explicit detail, his words circling the event without naming it, and the courtroom leaned in, not for what he said, but for what he could not bring himself to say, because omission can be as revealing as confession. Cross-examination was relentless, probing inconsistencies, motives, the benefits he stood to gain, and he absorbed it with a resigned patience, because whatever the outcome, the burden he carried had already changed him permanently. The man with the matching car sat motionless through it all, his expression carefully neutral, but those watching closely noted the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched when certain details surfaced, reactions too human to fully suppress. Experts followed, forensic analysts explaining partial matches and probabilities, psychologists discussing delayed confession and shared culpability, and while none of it provided cinematic certainty, it built a framework within which the jury could understand how a crime might vanish without erasing responsibility. Outside the courtroom, the town watched through screens and headlines, parsing every update, arguing over guilt and innocence in cafes and living rooms, because trials do not just judge defendants, they force communities to confront their own narratives. The family attended sporadically, unable to bear every detail, but present when it mattered, their quiet dignity becoming one of the most powerful elements of the proceedings, a reminder that the case was not an intellectual puzzle, but a human loss. As days passed, the prosecution shifted focus toward the aftermath, the deliberate acts taken to ensure that nothing could be traced cleanly, and in that shift, the case found its sharpest edge, because while memories fade, choices leave trails. Documents were introduced, property records, maintenance logs, financial anomalies, each one mundane on its own, devastating in accumulation, and the jury began to see the outline of a truth that did not rely on a single witness or piece of evidence, but on convergence. The defense pushed back hard, warning against narrative seduction, against filling gaps with assumption, and their caution resonated, because the justice system is built to resist exactly that temptation. Closing arguments arrived without fanfare, prosecutors urging jurors to consider not just the absence of proof, but the presence of explanation, the way each piece fit imperfectly yet persistently, and the defense reminding them that doubt is not a weakness, but a duty. When deliberations began, the courtroom emptied slowly, tension lingering like static, and outside, cameras waited, commentators speculated, and the town held its breath yet again, because after decades of uncertainty, the verdict, whatever it would be, promised not relief, but consequence. Hours turned into days, questions sent back to the judge, requests for testimony replayed, definitions clarified, and each delay stretched nerves thinner, because the longer deliberations last, the more outcomes seem possible. The family waited in private, not praying for a specific verdict, but for acknowledgement, for a recognition that their child's disappearance had mattered enough to warrant this moment. When word finally came that the jury had reached a decision, the message moved through the courthouse like a ripple, people standing instinctively, conversations dying mid-sentence, because whatever was about to be said would echo far beyond that room. The defendants were brought in, the jury filed back, and in that suspended moment before the verdict was read, the weight of nearly 3 decades pressed down on everyone present, a reminder that justice, when delayed, does not arrive clean or whole, but fractured, carrying the scars of time. And as the clerk prepared to speak, one truth had already settled over the room, regardless of outcome, that the silence which had protected this case for so long had finally been broken, and nothing, not verdicts, not appeals, not time itself, would ever be able to restore it again. The verdict was read without flourish, words delivered in an even tone that struggled to contain the weight they carried, guilty on some counts, not guilty on others, responsibility acknowledged but never fully named, and the reaction in the room was not applause or outrage, but something quieter and harder to define, a collective exhale mixed with disappointment, because after decades of waiting, the truth had arrived incomplete. The man with the matching car stared straight ahead as the decision landed, his face unreadable, neither relief nor shock breaking through, because verdicts do not always resolve what guilt has already carved into a person, and whatever the law had decided, his life had narrowed irrevocably. The confessed man lowered his head, not in triumph or surrender, but in exhaustion, as if the final word had taken from him the last excuse to keep carrying what remained unsaid, and those watching understood that legal outcomes do not erase moral weight, they merely define its boundaries. The family listened in silence, hands clasped, eyes fixed forward, absorbing a result that acknowledged wrongdoing without restoring what was lost, and when asked later how they felt, they chose their words carefully, saying only that the truth had finally been spoken aloud, even if not fully heard. Outside the courthouse, reactions splintered, some calling the verdict a victory, others a failure, debates igniting instantly, because cold cases solved late in time rarely satisfy the hunger they awaken. They only remind people how much was taken by delay. Sentencing dates were set, appeals promised, statements prepared, and the machinery of justice continued its slow, procedural march, indifferent to the emotional aftermath unfolding beyond its walls. In the weeks that followed, the town attempted to settle back into routine, but routine felt thinner now, more fragile, because the case had stripped away comforting illusions, revealing how easily normal life can coexist with unspoken harm. The shortcut path remained fenced off, overgrown and unused, not by order, but by consensus, a quiet agreement that some places carry too much memory to be repurposed, and children learn new routes home without ever being told why. The family returned to private life, the public attention receding at last, but the absence at the center of their world unchanged, because justice can acknowledge loss, but it cannot replace what time has taken. Investigators closed the case file officially, stamped and archived, though several admitted privately that some questions would never stop circling in their minds, the unanswered details, the moments that did not fit cleanly, the suspicion that more was known than had ever been spoken. The confessed man entered a system designed to contain him, protected yet isolated, his testimony on record, his silences preserved alongside his words, and those who reviewed the transcripts noted what was missing as often as what was present, because even at the end, the truth had arrived selectively. The man with the matching car began serving his sentence, reduced from what many had expected, and that disparity fueled quiet anger, not just toward him, but toward the years that had allowed evidence to decay and accountability to fragment. As media attention drifted elsewhere, the case slipped into history, cited in documentaries, podcasts, cautionary editorials about lost time and institutional failure, becoming a symbol rather than a story, and symbols, while powerful, are never complete. On the anniversary of the disappearance, a small gathering formed near the edge of town. No cameras, no speeches, just candles placed carefully against the dark, each flame a refusal to forget, a reminder that resolution is not the same as peace. Those who stood there spoke quietly about memory, about how some nights never end. They only stretch across years, shaping lives in ways no verdict can undo. The cold case was no longer unsolved, at least not on paper, but it remained unsettled in the ways that matter most, because the disappearance of a child leaves behind a silence that no explanation fully fills. And somewhere between what was proven and what was merely known, between what was said under oath and what was carried to the grave, the truth continued to exist in fragments, sharp, incomplete, and enduring. The nation moved on, headlines faded, attention shifted, but in that town, on that street, near that path no one used anymore, the past remained close. A quiet presence felt rather than seen, because some stories do not end when the credits roll. They linger, unresolved in spirit if not in law, reminding anyone who listens that time does not heal all wounds, it only teaches communities how to live alongside them, and that the night a child vanished in 1995 never truly ended, it simply learned how to hide in daylight. Years passed in a way that felt both sudden and endless, the kind of time that moves quickly on calendars but slowly in memory, and with each passing season the case receded further from daily conversation, yet never fully disappeared, because stories like this do not fade, they sink, embedding themselves beneath routine where they surface unexpectedly. The courthouse emptied, files boxed and shelved, transcripts digitized and archived, and on paper the case reached its terminus, marked closed, adjudicated, resolved enough to satisfy procedure, but resolution on paper has never guaranteed resolution in the mind. And those who had lived inside the investigation understood that better than anyone. The lead detective retired quietly, no ceremony, no speeches, leaving behind a desk cleared of photographs and notes but not of memory, because certain cases do not stay behind when the badge is turned in. They follow, appearing in dreams, in idle moments, in the spaces between thought and sleep. He would later admit to friends that what haunted him most was not what had been proven, but what had hovered just outside proof, the almosts, the hesitations, the moments where a question might have been asked differently, sooner, louder, and the knowledge that time had taken those chances permanently. The prosecutors moved on to new cases, new crimes, new victims, carrying with them the quiet awareness that justice delayed reshapes justice itself, forcing compromises that feel necessary but never comfortable, and in lectures and closed-door discussions, the case was referenced as a lesson. Not in triumph, but in caution. The confessed man remained alive but absent, existing within systems designed to contain risk, his name rarely spoken publicly now, his testimony reduced to footnotes and citations, and those who encountered him described a man diminished not by punishment alone, but by the knowledge that he had survived the truth without fully releasing it. The other man served his time, counted in years rather than decades, and when he was eventually released under supervision, there was no return to normalcy because normal had been stripped away by exposure, by a verdict that followed him like a shadow, unspoken but unmistakable. He moved through life carefully, avoiding attention, avoiding questions, and those who crossed his path sensed something unresolved, not just in the public record, but in the way he carried himself, as if the past were always just a step behind, waiting. The family marked milestones quietly, birthdays uncelebrated, anniversaries observed without announcement, their grief evolving but never shrinking, because grief does not obey legal outcomes, it adapts, finding new shapes as time passes. They declined interviews, declined offers to revisit the case, choosing instead to protect what remained of their private life, and in doing so, they reclaimed a measure of control that had been taken from them decades earlier. The town itself changed, new businesses, new families, new names on mailboxes, but certain spaces resisted transformation, the shortcut path left untouched, the service road rarely used, landmarks quietly absorbing the weight of what had happened nearby. Children grew up without knowing the full story, only fragments, warnings passed down indirectly, instincts shaped by an absence they could not name, and that absence became part of the town's character, an inherited caution woven into daily life. Occasionally, the case resurfaced in national media, framed as a solved cold case, a success of persistence and modern investigation, and those who knew the details watched these summaries with mixed feelings, recognizing the need for closure while bristling at the simplifications. Because what had happened was not neat, not complete, not fully spoken. Online forums continued to dissect the case long after official interest waned, anonymous users debating theories, filling gaps with speculation, and while most of it drifted into noise, some threads lingered disturbingly close to truths that had never been entered into evidence. Investigators avoided those discussions, not out of disinterest, but out of self-preservation, because reopening that mental terrain offered no answers, only reminders of how much remains unknowable once time has done its work. On one quiet evening, years after the verdict, a letter arrived at the station without a return address, containing no confession, no revelation, only a few lines written in unsteady hand, saying that some truths are carried not out of cruelty, but fear, and that fear does not expire with time. And while the letter offered nothing actionable, it confirmed something many had long suspected, that the full story had never been told. The letter was logged, archived, added to a file no one was actively reading anymore, another fragment in a case built on fragments, and its presence changed nothing officially while altering everything privately for those who read it. As seasons continued to turn, the case settled into its final form, not as a closed chapter, but as a quiet undertow beneath the town's present, influencing choices, shaping trust, reminding people that safety is not guaranteed by familiarity. The disappearance of a child in 1995 remained a reference point, a before and after dividing line, and even those born long after felt its influence in subtle ways, in the routes they chose, the caution they learned without being taught. Cold cases, when reopened, promise answers, but what they often deliver is something more complicated: an accounting, a confrontation with time itself, and this case was no exception, leaving behind a truth that existed in layers rather than conclusions. Somewhere between what the law recorded and what memory retained, the story continued to live, not loudly, not urgently, but persistently, because unresolved truths do not disappear, they wait. And in that waiting, in the quiet spaces where certainty never arrived, the case continued to do what it had always done best: remind those who remembered that silence can be as powerful as action, that fear can shape decades, and that the disappearance of a child is never confined to a single night. It becomes a presence, subtle and enduring, woven into the fabric of a place and its people, a reminder that some answers come too late to heal, and some truths, once delayed, can only be carried forward, never fully laid to rest. In the end, what lingered was not the verdict, not the sentences, not even the transcripts stacked in archives, but a question that never made it into the courtroom, one that lived only in the pauses between words, in the looks that broke away too quickly, in the details that were always described as lost to time. Years after everything was said to be finished, a journalist revisiting old cold cases requested access to the files, not chasing scandal, not promising revelations, just tracing the anatomy of silence, and what struck her most was not what was missing, but what was almost there. The near connections, the moments where truth brushed against the surface and slipped away again. She noticed how often fear appeared without being named, how many statements leaned on phrases like, "I don't remember," and "it didn't seem important," and how consistently those phrases clustered around the same names, the same locations, the same stretch of years following the disappearance. In interviews conducted long after the trial, people spoke more freely, age softening caution, distance dulling fear, and while none offered confessions, their language shifted subtly, responsibility reframed as inevitability, silence justified as survival. Because time has a way of turning moral failures into neutral facts if they go unchallenged long enough. One former municipal worker admitted off record that rumors had circulated back then, nothing concrete, nothing reportable, just enough to make people avoid certain conversations, enough to make them understand which questions would close doors rather than open them, and that understanding, he said, had been as clear as any written order. The journalist traced those rumors to places rather than people: a maintenance yard, a stretch of service road, an unofficial dumping site everyone pretended not to know about, and while none of it contradicted the official narrative, it complicated it, adding texture where the record remained flat. She visited the town, walked its streets, followed the routes described in testimony, noting how ordinary everything felt, how easily a life could move through these spaces without friction, and that ordinariness unsettled her more than any dramatic revelation ever could. At the edge of the fenced-off shortcut path, weeds pushing through cracked asphalt, she paused, listening to the quiet, because silence here did not feel empty. It felt curated, maintained by years of collective agreement not to linger. Locals avoided her questions politely, offering directions instead, changing subjects with practiced ease, and she realized then that the case had not just shaped memory, it had trained behavior, teaching people how to navigate absence without naming it. When her article was published, it caused little stir, no headlines, no renewed investigation, because it offered no bombshells, only a careful accounting of how truth can be diluted by time and fear until it becomes almost indistinguishable from forgetting. Those who read it closely felt a familiar discomfort, a recognition without surprise, because nothing in it contradicted what they had always sensed, that the case had ended legally, but never morally. The family read it too, quietly, and while it reopened nothing officially, it affirmed something privately, that their understanding of the past, incomplete and painful as it was, had never been imaginary. In conversations years later, people still spoke of the case in lowered voices, even as details blurred, because some stories embed themselves not in facts but in instinct, shaping how communities move, trust, and protect themselves. Children who had once been warned now warned their own, passing along caution without context, because fear outlives explanation, and the disappearance remained present not as a lesson taught, but as a behavior inherited. The cold case entered textbooks, cited as an example of delayed justice, of investigative persistence, of systemic failure, depending on who was writing, and each version carried its own truth while missing others, because no single telling could hold it all. And somewhere beyond records and memory, beyond testimony and verdicts, the unanswered parts remained intact, sealed not by law but by choice, carried by those who had learned long ago that survival sometimes depends on silence. That was the final legacy of the case, not resolution, but awareness, an understanding etched into the town's collective consciousness that harm does not always announce itself, that evil does not always look like intrusion, and that familiarity can be its most effective disguise. The night the child vanished in 1995 no longer dominated headlines, no longer commanded attention, but it continued to exist in quieter ways, in avoided paths, in unasked questions, in the way people glanced twice before trusting what felt safe. Cold cases promise closure, but what they often deliver is a mirror, reflecting not just what happened, but who people chose to be in response, and this one reflected a truth too complex to resolve neatly. It showed how time can protect lies as effectively as it erodes evidence, how fear can become communal, and how justice, when it arrives late, must navigate a landscape already reshaped by years of silence. And so the story did not end with answers, but with persistence, a quiet, enduring presence that refused to disappear completely, reminding anyone willing to listen that some truths are not buried because they are unknown, but because too many people learned how to live with them. In that way, the cold case never truly closed. It simply learned how to exist without demanding attention, a shadow woven into daylight, a reminder that the past does not fade when it is unresolved. It waits. Time moved on the way it always does, indifferent and thorough, sanding down the sharpest edges while leaving the shape intact, and with enough distance, the case became something people referred to indirectly, not by name but by implication, that year, that night. That story everyone knows without being told. New officers joined the department having studied the file only in training modules, summaries distilled into bullet points, timelines flattened for efficiency, and yet those who later encountered the town in person sensed something the paperwork could not convey. A residue of caution that clung to ordinary interactions, an unspoken awareness that some lines, once crossed, never fully recede. Occasionally, a rookie would ask a veteran about it, about what really happened, and the answer was always the same, a pause, a shrug, a warning disguised as advice. Some things don't end cleanly, learn to live with that, and the conversation would drift elsewhere. Because even curiosity had learned its limits here. The evidence room still held remnants of the case, sealed boxes labeled with dates that now felt unreal, and during routine audits, clerks handled them with an extra measure of care, as if the cardboard itself carried weight. As if opening them too often might invite something back that had finally gone quiet. In the town, development continued cautiously, plans rerouted, projects delayed, not by official decree but by consensus, because no one wanted to be responsible for disturbing ground that carried so much unresolved history, and that reluctance shaped the landscape in subtle ways. Empty lots preserved, roads bending slightly out of their original path. The family moved farther away, not fleeing, not forgetting, simply seeking a place where their grief was not a public artifact, and though they left, the town never stopped associating their absence with the child who never came home, because some losses leave a double void, one for what was taken, and one for those forced to carry it. Every so often, someone would claim to remember something new, a detail overlooked, a conversation misinterpreted, and those claims were logged politely, reviewed carefully, and set aside gently, because memory, after so long, is a fragile thing, easily shaped by suggestion, easily mistaken for truth. Still, investigators listened, because listening had become part of the case's legacy, an acknowledgement that silence had done enough damage already, and even if no new answers emerged, the act of hearing mattered. On anniversaries, the local paper ran smaller notices now, a paragraph rather than a headline, reminding readers of the date, the age the child would have been, and those notices were read quietly, folded away because grief had settled into routine, no longer sharp but no less present. In classrooms, teachers avoided the topic unless asked, and when they chose their words carefully, framing the story as a reminder to look out for one another, to notice when something feels wrong, because lessons drawn from pain must be handled gently if they are to endure. Years later, a public records request revealed one final anomaly, a minor discrepancy in a logbook that had never been reconciled, and while it sparked brief discussion among those who noticed it, no investigation followed, because by then, the threshold for reopening had become impossibly high. That discrepancy joined the others, the maybes and almost that define the case, not as failures, but as markers of how close truth can come without ever fully arriving. Those involved learned to accept that some answers remain just out of reach, not because they are unknowable, but because they are withheld, protected by choices made long ago and reinforced by time. The cold case lived on not in active pursuit, but in quiet vigilance, in the way people double-checked doors, in the way parents lingered a moment longer at goodbyes, habits formed without conscious thought, shaped by a story that never truly ended. Visitors sometimes remarked on how peaceful the town felt, how orderly, how safe, and locals smiled politely, understanding that peace and safety are not the same thing, that one can exist alongside buried fear without contradiction. The disappearance had taught them that danger does not always arrive loudly, that it can slip in unnoticed, wrapped in familiarity, and that knowledge lingered, a kind of collective intuition passed down without explanation. In private moments, some still wondered what would have happened if one person had spoken sooner, acted differently, refused silence, and those questions lingered without answers, because hypotheticals offer no comfort when time has already passed its verdict. The cold case had given the town a language for absence, a way to acknowledge what was missing without naming it, and that language became part of its identity, shaping how it remembered, how it mourned, how it moved forward. In the end, the story did not resolve into clarity or closure, but into endurance, a testament to how events echo beyond their moment, influencing lives long after the headlines fade. The night in 1995 remained a fixed point, not frozen, but anchored, and everything that came after bent subtly around it, proof that some moments do not pass, they persist. And so the case continued, not in courts or files, but in memory and behavior, in the spaces between trust and caution, in the quiet understanding that the past is never entirely gone. It watches. By the time the story reached its 15th year beyond resolution, it no longer announced itself as tragedy, it existed as atmosphere, something felt rather than spoken, like a pressure change before weather turns. People who had lived there long enough sensed it instinctively, the way certain evenings felt heavier, the way silence settled too easily in familiar places, because memory, when shared by a community, becomes environmental. The old maintenance yard was finally dismantled, not erased but repurposed carefully, layers removed one by one under supervision, and nothing was officially found, no discovery, no revelation, only the quiet confirmation that some sites absorb history without ever releasing it again. Those overseeing the work spoke later of unease, of the sense that they were trespassing on something intangible, and though the project concluded without incident, no one lingered there afterward, as if completion itself demanded distance. A new generation grew into adulthood, knowing the story only as background noise, a cautionary echo, and yet it shaped them all the same, teaching vigilance without fear, restraint without explanation, the kind of inheritance that doesn't feel like one until much later. They learned to watch patterns, to notice absence, to trust instinct when something felt wrong, and though they could not articulate why, they carried forward a lesson forged by loss rather than instruction. The case continued to surface in academic circles, criminology seminars dissecting its timeline, sociologists examining the dynamics of collective silence, and each analysis added clarity while simultaneously stripping away the human weight, because distance allows understanding but dulls impact. Those closest to it rarely engaged with those discussions, knowing that theory cannot replicate the texture of lived uncertainty, the way waiting reshapes a life, the way not knowing becomes its own form of knowledge. Occasionally, someone would stand at the edge of the unused path, now partially reclaimed by grass, and feel the pull of curiosity, the urge to imagine what truly happened, and then turn away, because imagination offers no answers, only echoes. The family, long removed from public view, found a fragile equilibrium, grief softened but never diminished, carrying forward a private remembrance untethered from headlines, because remembrance does not require an audience to remain real. They marked the child's existence, not through anniversaries, but through small rituals, habits built quietly into daily life, gestures of continuity rather than mourning, because survival demands adaptation. The town learned the same lesson, gradually, imperfectly, learning to live alongside the unresolved without allowing it to define every moment, because communities, like individuals, must keep moving even when something remains unfinished. And yet, on certain nights, when streets emptied early and lights dimmed, the sense returned, that awareness that something essential had slipped through the cracks long ago and never been recovered. Cold cases do not end when files are closed. They change state, shifting from pursuit to presence, from question to warning, and this one settled into its role with quiet persistence. It reminded people that certainty is fragile, that justice is constrained by time, and that silence, once chosen, becomes harder to break with every passing year. The disappearance of a child in 1995 became less a story and more a reference point, a line drawn through collective memory dividing innocence from awareness, before and after. Those who remembered the world before spoke of it differently, softer, less guarded, and those who came after accepted vigilance as normal, unaware it had ever been otherwise. In that way, the case continued to shape lives long after legal outcomes faded, not through fear alone, but through an enduring attentiveness, a refusal to assume safety without question. The night itself remained unknowable in full, its details scattered across memory, testimony, and silence, but its impact endured, proving that events do not need resolution to exert influence. They only need to happen once. And somewhere within the layers of what was said and what was withheld, between records and recollection, the truth remained present, incomplete, unresolved, waiting not for discovery, but for acknowledgement. Because some stories are not meant to conclude. They persist. Eventually, even persistence settles into something quieter, less demanding, and the case entered that phase where it no longer asked to be understood, only remembered, a background hum beneath ordinary life that few noticed until it stopped. No one could say exactly when that happened, when the absence became so familiar it felt almost stable, but those who paid attention sensed the shift, the way conversations no longer stalled at its mention, the way people no longer lowered their voices instinctively, not because the weight was gone, but because it had been absorbed. The town's rhythms adjusted around it, annual events resuming without reference, new traditions forming that had nothing to do with loss, and this, too, was survival, because a place cannot exist forever in a state of mourning without erasing itself. Yet the case retained its power in moments of interruption, when a siren cut through the night, when a child failed to arrive home on time, when a stranger lingered too long at the edge of familiarity, and in those moments, memories surged back into focus, sharp and immediate. Former investigators noticed it in themselves as well. The way their instincts had been permanently recalibrated, caution layered over experience, trust tempered by what they had seen slip through unnoticed once before. They spoke rarely of the case now, but when they did, it was without anger, without urgency, just a sober acknowledgement that some failures are not dramatic. They are procedural, incremental, built from small hesitations that accumulate until it is too late. The files remained intact, preserved more carefully than most, not because anyone expected to reopen them, but because preservation itself had become a form of respect, a recognition that what was lost deserved at least that. In quiet moments, archivists handling the materials described a sensation difficult to articulate, a sense that the case resisted closure even physically, that its weight persisted regardless of how neatly it was filed. The town's geography continued to evolve, but certain lines never shifted, routes that curved away from specific places without explanation, spaces that remained conspicuously empty, as if absence itself had been zoned. Visitors passed through unaware, praising the calm, the order, the sense of safety, and locals nodded politely, understanding that safety is not the absence of harm, but the presence of memory strong enough to prevent repetition. The family's story faded from public awareness entirely, their names no longer recognized outside those who remembered the beginning, but the child remained, not as a person the town could describe, but as a moment that could never be undone. That transformation, from individual to symbol, was neither fair nor avoidable. It was simply what time does when it outlasts detail. Cold cases, once solved or partially resolved, leave behind a different kind of responsibility, not to investigate, but to remember accurately, without myth, without distortion, and that responsibility fell unevenly, carried by those who had lived through the waiting. They remembered the uncertainty more vividly than the facts, the way days stretched, the way hope reorganized itself around rumor and speculation, and that memory shaped how they responded to future crises, slower to assume, quicker to question. As years accumulated, the case lost its edges but not its gravity, a lesson embedded so deeply it no longer needed articulation, influencing decisions in ways no one consciously traced back to its source. The disappearance became part of the town's moral infrastructure, an invisible framework guiding behavior, reinforcing vigilance, encouraging intervention, discouraging silence. That was its quiet legacy, not justice, not closure, but alteration, a permanent adjustment to how people understood responsibility. The night in 1995 no longer dominated thought, but it remained a reference point, proof that normalcy can fracture without warning, that harm can arrive quietly, that familiarity is not immunity. And in that understanding, incomplete and imperfect, the case continued to live, not as an open wound, but as scar tissue, evidence of healing that still marks where damage occurred. Some scars fade. This one endured.